We now return to our top story on the Ukraine conflict. We are joined by Ambassador Mohan Kumar from New Delhi to examine the contours of the Ukraine conflict. Good evening and welcome, Ambassador Kumar. Now, in the span of a day, Ukraine president talks about diplomacy and also a victory plan vis-a-vis the conflict with Russia. How precarious is his situation?
Thank you very much for having me. No, it's very clear that something is shifting in the conflict in Ukraine. I think you could attribute the trigger factor to the election of Donald Trump as the next president of the United States. But clearly, the Ukrainian president Zelensky has read the writing on the wall, and he's talking about a diplomatic solution. I want to say that the situation on the war front, on the battleground, is also not favorable to Ukraine. October is a month in which Ukraine has lost the maximum amount of land since the war began in February, March 2022. You then have the German Chancellor who has called President Putin, and he's talking about urging him to end the war. So all in all, frankly, I see the situation as being conducive now for a diplomatic solution, but that's only because I think Putin has stood his ground. It's very hard to avoid the impression that Ukraine could have done this much earlier.
Ambassador Kumar, in view of the German Chancellor calling Putin, communication lines are opening up despite President Zelensky talking about isolating President Putin. Is it a sign of the center of gravity, of center of importance shifting from Ukraine and its leadership?
Yes, I think you're right. There is no attempt anymore to isolate Putin, because I think, as I said, the situation has changed. I think Zelensky now has to worry about his own legacy, his own future. And he's, as I said, read the writing on the wall. If this is Scholz calling Putin today, it'll be Macron tomorrow. And you will also notice that Scholz has made it a point to not just talk to Putin, but before the call to Putin, he made it a point to brief Zelensky. I understand now that he has also briefed the Polish leader, Donald Tusk, after his conversation with Putin. So I see something really shifting now in the conflict in Ukraine. I think we are invariably and inevitably proceeding towards a diplomatic solution. The trouble is, this is anything but favorable to Ukraine. And that is what I feel bad about, because the West has not been able to see the writing on the wall. One could argue that India has turned out to be right, because we've been saying for a very long time that you cannot find a solution on the battleground, and that you have to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict in Ukraine. It appears everybody has now heard India.
And given that much of what happens next, Ambassador, is going to be driven by US President-elect Donald Trump's worldview, what kind of possible solution are we looking at of this conflict? What would it look like at the end?
So thank you for asking that question. Frankly, there are no two ways about it. You cannot expect Russia to return the territories it is occupying in the eastern part of the country, what is known loosely as the Donbas region. So Russia is going to keep Crimea, which they took in 2014. They are going to keep the territories in the eastern part of Ukraine, which they have occupied. And then the negotiations are essentially going to center on whether Ukraine will be part of NATO or not, whether the sanctions on Russia will be lifted or not, and what kind of a Ukraine will be left with to join the European Union at best. Frankly, these are the three things which are negotiable. I don't think negotiation is going to include land. It's not a land for peace situation. So the negotiations are essentially going to center on building a security architecture in Europe, which will keep Russia and Ukraine both quiet for a period of time.
And I want to return to the kind of agency that the Ukrainian president still has. I'm saying this in the context of a certain victory plan that he presented in the parliament today, which he is going to present to the European leaders tomorrow, which talks again about military support, ongoing military support for Ukraine. But does it look realistic, practical anymore?
The United States, I don't think, will be able to give much more military aid. And as you know, the US has given bulk of the military aid. I think it is crunch time for the European Union, because a lot of the European leaders will have egg on their face. They have been saying that the only possible solution is for Russia to end the war and withdraw from the occupied territories. And by the way, that claim was repeated by Olaf Scholz even in the phone call. But I am beginning to think, and a number of people are beginning to think, that this is purely rhetoric. Nobody seriously believes Russia to withdraw from the territories it has occupied. Therefore, I agree with you that a lot of it is really rhetoric from Ukraine. There will be aid which will continue for Ukraine until the peace talks commence sometime next year, after Donald Trump becomes the president of the United States.
And Ambassador, beyond Ukraine, given that we have some insight into the manner in which President-elect Donald Trump looks at the Ukraine conflict and America's engagement with NATO as well, beyond Ukraine, what kind of strategic and financial cost should the NATO be considering to pay in the Trump era in the coming years?
Well, Trump's own relationship with NATO will come under the scanner. Frankly, it is very clear that with Trump, what you see is what you get. And he has been loud and clear during the campaign that he does not want to pay the bills for NATO. So unless the European countries and other NATO members like Canada, if they can come to the party and pay more than 2% of their GDP, then NATO can be saved. Otherwise, I see a very bleak future for NATO. Putin knows this only too well. Putin is a shrewd observer of the international strategic landscape, and he knows that this is the right time to do a deal. The problem I see is how the Europeans, who have started ratcheting up the pressure over the last 1 year, they will now have to somehow do a climb down. And that is not easy, because they went on saying that we will support Ukraine as long as it takes, etc., etc. But now that Zelensky has said it must end through a diplomatic solution, focus will quickly now shift to what kind of a diplomatic solution is acceptable to both sides, in particular to Zelensky and his European patrons.
And in this impending flux in the West-led global order, do you see a certain advantage Putin, Russia?
Absolutely. I really believe that Putin has stood his ground. Everybody knew that if this was going to turn out to be a war of attrition, Russia will ultimately prevail, because they've got more material, they've got more men, and they've got more resources. It's simply a much bigger country. But from India's perspective, I also believe the ending of the war is good news, because frankly, it was beginning to hurt the global economy and in turn our economy. So the ending of the war is something that will be welcomed by countries of the global south.
Ambassador Mohan Kumar, thank you very much for joining us on the News Hour, sharing your perspective.